This is a bit of a strange one. I hope that people will appreciate this. The microphone seems quite low. I hope you guys can hear me. Is there any way I can boost it? I don't think there is. Sometimes when life gives you lemons, you don't make lemonade, you make life take the lemons back, as Cabe Johnson once said. I wish that was something I could just do. When things go very badly wrong and your life is upset, you realize how fragile life can be, and that sometimes the person you are, as you recognize yourself, could just disappear overnight and you would never know that person again. And no one might ever know that person again. Even if your life goes on, your identity doesn't always. Sometimes people just forget who they are, metaphorically or literally. Sometimes your life just becomes so much about struggling against circumstances that it subsumes everything else and you forget everything. And sometimes people just drop dead. Life can be very fragile, and you can go at any moment. And right now feels like a fragile moment for me. I had an ear infection in my left ear, and since then, for 3 weeks, I've been struggling with really, really bad tinnitus. And that may not seem bad to you if your idea of tinnitus is just a little bit of a screech for a couple of hours after a loud rock concert. But that's not tinnitus. Tinnitus is being in bed at 2 a.m. with a screaming sound like a dentist drill in your ear while you're trying to sleep, knowing that you can't sleep, and knowing that not getting enough sleep will probably make the tinnitus worse in the morning, and waking up to having another screeching or hissing sound in your ear again. It saps the body's patience and endurance and makes you feel fatigued all the time. And because this is a moment of fragility, I feel pushed to leave something behind because I'm now, what, 52? I don't have children. I don't know if I'll ever have children. My legacy, as it were, never seems to have materialized. I'm not sure if it ever will now. And a man feels compelled to leave behind a record of his dreams and hopes so that at least something will persist after him. And that's the point of this autobiography. Dreams and hopes. I want to leave a record of dreams and hopes, and of why they are the way they are, and why I am the way I am. Not so that people will cry for me, or miss me, or whatever, because I don't know what comes next, but because I want people to remember me. Ideally, I'd like people to remember the version of me that I hoped to be, even if I never become that, and the things that I hope to do, even if I never achieve them. I want to pass that on, to impress other people with it, with the goodness of that dream. I want to feel, at least in a little way, that some of that is going to live after me. So, I was born in Sheffield to two fairly ordinary looking young people. One was a chartered accountant very early on in his career, something of a go getter. the first kid in his family to go to university. His father was a traveling salesman, and his mother was a ward matron, and who retired to marry his father. And they were very proud of him, and he worked very, very hard. My mother, I know less about her youth. I know that there was a lot of rifts between her and her parents, that there were difficulties there, but she spent some time in care. But she became a psychiatric nurse before she met my dad, retired to take care of us kids. So I was born in Sheffield, but my earliest memories are from Birmingham. A little house with a garden and a tree that separated the house from the next door neighbours. There was a fence or a hedge or I don't know what, but there was this tree that straddled the boundary. And the branches were low, but there was a space underneath that children could play, that I played. And I played with this little girl in the house next door with curly blonde hair. And she lent me a fruit machine toy, like a little plastic toy with like a fruit machine, a one-armed bandit style toy. Um, and I remember the day we moved out, I didn't know when we were moving out the exact day, and I hadn't seen her to give it back to her. And I was distraught about this, and I ended up putting it under that tree, hoping she would find it. I'd hoped to see her one more time. I remember a piece of Lego that got stuck between the floorboards and desperately trying to dig it out, and being bereft that this Lego was stuck in the floorboards. I remember the local playground and just mucking about on the slide and the climbing frame. I don't really remember any friends other than the girl next door. I don't know if it was Birmingham or somewhere else, but I vaguely remember a basement with a door at the top of the stairs to the basement, and I was under strict instructions not to go down there. And once I was allowed to go down with my dad, and it was a big experience, like all of these paint cans and tools and things just splayed out around this little low space with a dim bulb. I must have been about 3 or something. And the reason I know I was about 3 is because my 4th birthday happened right here in this room when we moved back up to Yorkshire. I remember playing with a Casio keyboard that my parents soon wished they hadn't given me. I vaguely remember breaking a panel of glass in a house, it was either here or the last one, with my head, and my mother forcing my head under the sink to try and wash bits of glass out of my hair, because while there wasn't any blood per se, as I recall, there was glass, and I'd managed to break something or crack something. I remember the hole in the road in Sheffield, and the fish, and being fascinated by the fish in these aquatic tanks in this underground subway in this large open space with a hole above us looking at the sky. It's a kind of subterranean cavity underneath a roundabout with a skylight. Massive thing. It's been filled in now. um, I was not a normal child. I was not a normal child. My mum said I learnt to count before the age of 1, She's no longer with us, so I've no one to corroborate that, and my dad doesn't remember it. And for all I know, it was a throwaway comment she didn't really mean. But the point is, I developed pretty abnormally. I had a fascination with clockwork, and they bought me cuckoo clocks so I could look at the mechanisms and watch them tick. Um, I was not a normal kid. Autistic, as it would later come to be known, although that wouldn't be found out for decades. I did not do well in school. I mean, before we go there, I should probably talk about my brother being born. I think that happened here. I remember something on the lines of the midwife saying, "Your brother's been born," and right, that's great, the midwife can take him with her, or something like that. I wasn't hugely keen on the new addition to the family, God bless my soul. I've never been a big fan of change, and here was this huge change I couldn't control. And so many things that I would normally have wanted to have controlled, I couldn't because everything had to bow to the baby and to the baby's coming and your mum's having a baby. I've never been good with change. And yet I'm so blessed to have a brother I can turn to, even though we fought like cats and dogs for most of our childhood. Um, my life at school was not an easy one. I struggled to read. My mum would sit me on her lap and make me read Peter and Jane books, and I would do everything to try and get away. And she would like, "No, what does this word? What's the next word?" And I'm like, "I don't know the next word. Guess the next word." And I'm like, "Some J Peter," and I'm like, "I don't know. He doesn't kick the ball. You're just guessing." I said, "Yes, you told me to guess." Well, I'm, you know, that sort of thing. I couldn't remember my times tables. Very, very dyslexic, as it turns out. Um, and yet also absurdly intelligent, allegedly, people say. I was very, 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 very unhappy in school. I went to a little C of E primary school. It was a junior school, actually. It was before the primary secondary system, as I recall. And I was always in fights with the teachers. It was just absolute chaos at all times and all places. Because I felt like the world was stacked against me and everything was unfair. Because in a very real sense, it was. They weren't teaching me, they were there to control and police me. That's not just how I felt, that is really was how it was. Because in some areas I was so advanced that I was way, way, way past what they were able to teach me. My knowledge of computing and electronics and stuff was just amazing. I was absorbing all of this. Oh yeah, I remember my mum has this story that when we went shopping, one of the early times she took me shopping as a toddler, I reached up and I asked her what kind of numbers are those, pointing to the signs above the shops, because I knew my numbers, but I didn't know my letters. I've always been good with numbers, except I can't remember my times tables. So I was kind of, they were just completely incapable of teaching me. Because in the areas where I had deficits, my deficits were huge and they just weren't able to address them because it was clearly something that needed a lot of one-to-one help. And in the areas where I was advanced, it was way beyond anything the class could handle. Um, I was good with computers, I was good with electronics and science, and everything that they did in terms of science was just so patronizing. I remember being sent to the class above to watch a squeezy lemon being dipped in bicarbonate of soda, uh, being dripped into bicarbonate of soda as if I'd never seen that before and didn't understand that acids and bases react. Like, no, I understand this. I've seen this. I've seen this. I want you to explain to me why it does it. Why does acids and bases react? Why is the bicarbonate of soda reacting with the lemon? I want explanations. So there was a lot of trouble. I had a handful of friends, and I use the term friends really loosely because I don't know. There was a girl called Helen who was a couple of years above me who kind of took me under her wing and mothered me, but she could only mother me so much, and she herself had fairly profound learning difficulties. A wonderful young adult now. Well, not even young adult now, but same age as me, roughly. I just remember her that way. But I happen to know she grew up and had a very well adjusted and happy life and found a nice husband. And there was a couple of kids who got teased all the time, and I naturally gravitated towards them because I felt like an outcast as well. And I bullied their bullies. If people hurt my friends, I hurt them. And I got into a lot of fights. And I never backed down, which was a problem because a lot of the fights I got into were with the teachers because I felt their behavior was unreasonable and they weren't really teaching me. Like I said, they felt just like my prison wardens, not my teachers. But I just stood up and snapped a pencil in front of my teacher in protest. And she was like, "Don't you dare. Those are important pencils, school pencils. How dare you snap a pencil?" Um, and started going on at me, and clearly not aware of how absolutely livid I was and how I felt that her treatment of me was so unreasonable. And she was just totally oblivious to the huge rage that was building behind my eyes. And so I picked up a chair and I threw it across the classroom. And I remember afterwards being told, "You could have really hurt her if that chair had hit her." And like, if I'd meant the chair to hit her, it would have hit her because it was really just that. I was so livid that I just lashed out and threw the chair to make a point. I didn't intend to hurt her, you know. I knew how to throw the chair so it would have hit her. I remember being constantly called to the school headmistress's room, being given lectures and being told, you have to understand about your school and all of this. And I remember responding, "Well, what you have to understand is that your lessons are boring." Um, and so one day I was sat on a seat. I'd been put out of a classroom and told I had to sit on this seat until my parents came. And my dad describes me as wailing. I wasn't wailing, as I remember. I was. I decided I was going to be an aeroplane. If I had to sit in this seat, I was going to have freedom inside my own mind. And so I imagined I was an aeroplane and that I was dive bombing and swooping and flying across the land. And so I was make believing that I was an aeroplane in this seat. And people say autistic children don't have any imagination. It's not true. It's total rubbish. We have tons of imagination. What we don't necessarily have is social imagination. Our imaginary play very often doesn't involve other characters aside from us, except in a really shallow way, often when we're young children anyway. I was not happy, and that was the day my parents told me they were taking me out of school. As I would later learn, they had basically been read the riot act by the school and said, "Look, we need to get him statement of the special needs, There's clearly something wrong with him. Um, we need to get extra funding from the government for people to keep an eye on him because we can't control him in class. And my mum was very much of the opinion that if they had gone down that route, I would have just been labeled as a problem and eventually filtered into a special school and never given an opportunity to excel or do anything or become anything or make anything of myself. So my parents decided to homeschool me, which they did for a long time. And I am so grateful that my mother chose and was willing to go to all of that length to deal with me because it was tough for her dealing with this kid who had a lot of special needs but was also really bright. I remember for a long time, an older man whom we used to meet. I think he used to go to our church, but he also used to hang out in the swimming pool, in the swimming baths that my mum would make me go to regularly. And he carried the Maplin's catalogue. And the Maplin's catalogue was a window into another world of excitement for me. Because as well as all of these interesting technological things that I could find in the catalogue, most of which I never bought, they had a books section. And you could buy really complicated technical books from the Maplin's catalogue. And I persuaded my mum to buy me these books for Christmases and birthdays because I did eventually learn to read. It was bloody hard. My mum would, as I say, sit me on her lap and have me read Peter and Jane, and stuff got progressively more complicated until I could do it. And I did get to the point where I could learn to read. I did read, and then I became a voracious reader, but mostly of nonfiction, at least initially. Um, I used to go to bed with the Amstrad computer manual to read it. That used to be bedside reading. I had Usborne books of computers and science books, and um, at one point I got really into eschatology, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a study of end times. Uh, I started reading my Bible and reading the revelatory books of the Bible, Revelations and Daniel and so forth, Ezekiel and that sort of thing, looking for codes and patterns and things. Because I am a fairly religious guy, and it wasn't just something that was instilled into me by my parents, it was a choice. All through my life, I felt like the world was wrong. It was broken and it was unfair and corrupt. And, you know, God and Jesus was. I felt that there ought to be something and someone out there who wanted to put the world to rights, to make it fairer, to make it kinder. I felt like there had to be. Like, surely there had to be out there a force trying to put the world to rights. And I think that very early sense kind of was the foundation that kind of led me to faith. I remember I must have been about 6. I'd only been out of school for a year or so, give or take. And I remember going into my mum's room in the middle of the night and saying, "Look, I think I believe in Jesus, and I want to know what I do to do this Christian stuff that you do and that Dad does." and just being told to go home, to go to my room and pray and accept it, and the sensation of peace and togetherness was incredible. This notion of not being alone anymore, this feeling of not being alone anymore was all enveloping. Yeah, it profoundly changed my life, and I will never not say that I believe it and I know it and I trust it to be true. For all of the screw ups and mistakes and problems and pains in my life, I still believe in that and that moment and that faith. Even if there's a hell of a lot I don't believe in now. And by that I mean mostly myself and my own expectations, I guess. So I really had no friends growing up until I reached my teens. None at all. I was homeschooled. My brother and I didn't get on. We didn't see eye to eye. We fought like cats and dogs. I was very lonely. My mum tried immensely to kind of build this ring of friends around me, but it was very superficial. People whom I had known from school would be carted out to birthday parties. Friends, it was like people from church, kids from church would be bussed in. Sunday school. I got into such trouble at Sunday school. I remember getting into an argument with a youth leader, and it was like you have to close your eyes when you pray. I'm like, no, I don't have to close my eyes when we pray in Sunday school. Can God not hear me when I have my eyes open? That's absurd. And there was another youth leader who came up with something so moronic, it amazed me. It's like, you must all close your eyes while we pray, and we will also close our eyes while we're praying, but we have magic eyelids, so we can see through them, so we will know if you have your eyes open. It's like, do you think we're imbeciles? Do you think that we were born yesterday? I appreciate, you know, 8 years, 7 years ago, maybe yesterday to an adult, but it's to theological arguments with Sunday school teachers, and our pastor at that point was a lovely man, um, and he wanted desperately to be a charismatic C of E vicar, but his congregation wouldn't let him. They were all very old, very conservative, very traditional. And I think if they'd have been allowed to have smells and bells, they probably would have, but it wasn't that sort of C of E church. But still, they had a lot of formality. And I remember going up to him and saying, "Oh, the Archbishop of Canterbury said there should be more dancing in churches. Will we have dancing in our church?" And he was like, probably not. God bless his soul, he tried. And the next vicar we got after him was a former nuclear physicist. And we had an argument, not an argument, an agreement with him, but we would share New Scientist magazines, which used to be a really cutting edge, popular science magazine. You would get really interesting research papers kind of summarized in layman's terms. Eh, so it was kind of like a research paper digest for people for interesting research papers, but in layman's terms. It isn't that anymore. It's much more dumbed down and much more much more targeted towards buzzwords and buzz topics. Um, but I still read it. So he wanted to have a subscription to New Scientist magazine. I had a subscription to New Scientist magazine, and we came to like a cost sharing agreement with my parents that I would lend him the magazines after I'd read them, and he'd bring them back again, which worked quite well. But that was we used to have lots of interesting conversations. But he always used to say, "Peter, I'm deeply concerned by your tendency to reinvent the wheel. You come up with his ideas as if they're totally new and they've been around for years, and it bothers me that nobody's told you about them. Because I really only had access to what my books said and to what my mum and dad knew, being homeschooled. I think there was a lot of wasted potential in my childhood. But as I said, I didn't really have any good friends through church. It was very, very shallow. I remember I used to go to Pathfinders, which was their kind of youthy group type thing. And we went away with me parents and some of the adults from church on a kind of retreat for a long weekend. And the kids all went walking around the kind of the country retreat. And I sprained my ankle really badly, like really, really badly. Um, and they just left me. They just left me in the field on my own and walked off like, oh, Peter's whining again. He's being a pain in the neck again. He's not really hurt. We're just gonna leave him because apparently I was always whining and complaining. And here I am in agony, limping, and about 2 hours later, I've managed to make it round from the back of this building because it was just a large compound, and we would only gone for a walk around the edge of the compound, really. But the only entrance was at the front. That was the only place you could get in or out. And so it took me an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours to get from the back of this compound to the front of this compound, which is quite large, actually get someone who'd help me. And when they finally got me back to my room, they were all in my room eating all my snacks. That was that was a level of camaraderie they had with me. I was not liked, I was not loved, I was tolerated at best. And they were some of the people who were kind of bussed in when my mum wanted people to fill seats at my birthdays and so on. Aside from a handful of people, I kind of my mum had kept tracked down from school. There was one friend, a guy called Alex, who was a dwarf, and I use that term advisedly. He had clinical dwarfism, and he was like 2 years older than me, and was already shorter than me when I went to school. And by the time that we were, hitting 7, 8, he was a lot shorter than me. Pituitary issue. Lovely guy. Wonderful, wonderful dude. Very adventurous, full of life, full of fun. Don't know why he wanted to hang out with me. Um, and I saw him more than pretty much any of my other old school friends because he lived reasonably close by, and our mothers would have us spend time together every now and then. Every now and then. Life was just tough. I was so lonely all the time, and I thought it would never end. And everything was tough. I went to various different things. Okay, I ballooned in weight really, really quickly. That's something you should know. Even when I was going to school in primary school, 4 or 5 years old, I was starting to get a little chubby, and I got quite heavy by the time I was kind of approaching my teens. I was getting noticeably obese, and partly because I was very sedentary. I've never been an outdoors person. I've never been the kind to go around having fun climbing trees and interacting with the outdoors. None of it appealed to me. My mum would take us on hikes and walks, and I'd be like, that's nice. There's a view. I've seen it. 5 seconds, I've seen the view. I'm ready to go. I've never been one who was in love with the outdoors, with the countryside, with um, kind of just being there. I enjoyed walks in the woods with my father. We used to there's a bit of local woodland in the middle of the city, and my father used to take us there quite regularly. I enjoyed the trees. I enjoyed the environment and walking through the woods and climbing up and down the slopes. But it wasn't the exercise that appealed to me. It was more the romance of this kind of wooded area and the muddy water and all of the secrets that could be hidden around, hiding behind trees, that kind of thing. Imaginary adventures in this forest, which is actually just a very small bit of woodland in the middle of the city. I used to have a really, really mixed relationship with my father. Whereas my mother, I could always go to and pretty much always talk to about almost anything, with the kind of perennial hang up that being raised in a good old-fashioned Christian household, you did not talk to your parents about sex. And to be honest, that's not unusual for kids anyway. Um, I think I did actually ask them once or twice about that, my mum about that, but got very vague answers and left it at that because it was obviously uncomfortable. But I felt like I could talk to my mum about almost anything, and did frequently talk to her about almost anything. About God, about religion, about science, about the world, everything. My dad, I have really fond memories of great times with him, of him telling us stories on the beach about Rowley Clark, an imaginary pirate he dreamed up, who went on various adventures. I remember play wrestling on his bed, which we used to do with me and my brother quite a lot when we were very young. Too young to really be much of a nuisance as young boys. I remember um, him taking us into his office to run around on a weekend because he had various bits of work to do. And we would kind of be let loose. I remember being let loose on his office computer to play with the spreadsheet software. He had this huge desk. At this point, he'd made partner, junior partner, I think. He had this huge desk with like a green leather kind of um, coating on it and a wood edge, a big, like fancy varnished wood edge, and a potted plant and a big IBM desktop and lamps, very fancy accounting lamps with the green shades and all kinds of little bric-a-brac that officers used to have, like Rolodexes and things. Not a Bakelite telephone, but a telephone, and had his own secretary. Um, yeah, living the life of Larry. And then we would kind of go to and from the drinks machine and the loo, and sometimes we would run through the kind of the communal office space, which was kind of not well, it was basically open plan. It was a mix of open plan and cubicles. Strange to bring your kids into an empty office, but it's like it was a bit of fun for us. Um, and he'd go to the mail room and check for mail because he had to check for mail on a Saturday. Sometimes someone had to check the mail on a Saturday. It was like a duty that they had on a roster or something, um, for various reasons. And yeah, so I have very fond, kind memories of my father. I also have memories of him being an absolute tyrant and a dictator. He would get absolutely livid about little things like me using my knife and fork in the wrong hand, and he would threaten and curse and um, get absolutely irate at this. He would get so angry with me when I couldn't remember my times tables, particularly, um, particularly 42. Like, oh, you can't remember that 6 times 7 is 42. That it's the meaning to life, the universe, and everything. How many times have we told you this? but I couldn't remember because it was just two random numbers from my point of view. It was just two random numbers and it meant nothing to me. Until you gave me the answer, it didn't mean anything to me. As he got so angry about this sort of thing. Mum almost never got angry about this kind of thing. Exasperated as she might get, she never got angry. Um, I was such a picky eater, and I've always been a picky eater. I just can't stand certain foods. I don't like fish. I don't like chicken. I don't like turkey. Don't really like any kind of poultry or seafood. They hated fish fingers, but they forced me to eat fish fingers so many times, and I just hated it so much. Made me want to vomit. And I'd refuse, and there'd be battles, and my father would threaten all manner of hellfire if I didn't eat my food. And yeah, I remember once I got a penknife and I wanted to test this penknife. And being the stupidest kid in the world, I went and I wanted to find the finest, thinnest thing I could test the penknife on to see how sharp it was. And stupidly, the thing I found was a Bible. And I cut off the corner of a Bible, like the corner of a page, thinking no one will notice just one page's corner being cut. But it didn't just cut off one, it cut right through a whole bunch of them. And I thought to myself, damn, I'm going to get in trouble for this. And so I think knowing that I was going to get in trouble, I just like, well, I might as well give it a good testing then. And I tested it out. And they found this, like, it's blasphemy, it's sacrilege. I think they forced me to take a freezing cold bath. They like put me in the bath and poured jugs of freezing cold water over me until I was good and sorry for cutting up a Bible, which in fairness I was. I didn't mean to damage it. I just wanted to test the knife. I just wanted to test the knife to see if it was any good. I did a lot of damage around the house, crayoning and drawing of things. Although I think the most severe thing I think ever was when I took off all the plugs on the wall because I wanted to see. I had a manual, like we have a DIY manual, and it showed you how a plug was wired and how electricity circuits work. And I read through that thing and I said, I want to see if this is actually how it works. I want to test my knowledge. So I unscrewed a plug with the electricity on. Like, as long as I don't touch these wires, I'll be fine because I won't get the live electricity. And I unscrewed several sockets to see if it was properly wired up. And I'm like, yep, our sockets are properly wired up. I mean, mum comes in and she's absolutely shocked and appalled. And I'm like, but I know not to touch this. I know I know if I touch this, I'll die, but I won't touch it. But mum's like, yeah, but does your little brother crawling on the floor know not to touch it? Like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. It just had not occurred to me. It had not even for a moment occurred to me as a little kid that me brother might stick his finger in there. All's well that ends well. Yeah, but I didn't feel understood by my dad. I felt like my mum kind of understood me. My dad, I used to draw pictures of robots and spaceships, and I'd show them to me dad. I'm like, isn't this cool? And he'd be like, why can't you draw something normal, like a bowl of fruit? And that is pretty strange thing actually, because it would be very abnormal if your child was drawing a bowl of fruit. But from my dad's point of view, that's kind of what art was. Art should be bowls of fruit and things like that. And why was I just so obsessed? It's like the nuclear physicist, the ex-nuclear physicist Vicker said, science is not my hobby, it is my obsession. And science fiction was kind of an adjunct of that. And of course, I would later become a scientist, turned it into a career kind of. But life was not easy. I didn't have any friends. I was very isolated. I spent a ton of time in the library reading. I loved my local library. It was a big thing that had a massive reference section on level 5. And I would just dive into the reference section and read and read and read. And I would find books that I wanted to buy and I would test them. I would like test drive them by asking the library if they could get a copy in from another library, because that was a service they offered. They could try and see if books were available at other libraries in the country, have them brought in for you for a limited period to read, and then they'd be sent back. And so that's how I test drove a lot of the academic books I was interested in before I just actually went and had asked for them for Christmas or birthday. It's a pretty good idea. The fact that we don't have good libraries anymore in this country is a tragedy. And by good libraries, I mean reference libraries with decent sized reference sections full of weighty academic books. Because there are kids like me who will pick them up and read them. And it was one of the very few sources of like meaningful education that my mum couldn't provide. The really technical stuff that I so desperately yearned for was the local library. My mum handled the 3 R's, the reading, the writing, the arithmetic. To a lesser extent, we looked at things like history, and there were lots of trips to museums, and particularly local history museums, because my mum was into local history in a big way. Um, and there were trips to museums that she arranged with me. I remember she had a friend who was a school teacher, and she kind of arm twisted her into taking me on a school trip as a child with their school to Jodrell Bank, which was absolutely fascinating. I ended up buying a dictionary of science that had nothing to do with astronomy, but it was fascinating to me at Jodrell Bank. But I love the planetarium, and it was a fascinating museum. And I remember peeing my pants on the way down because she had to meet the coach not at the school, but with me. So the coach was picking her up and me up at a roadside in the middle of nowhere. And I desperately needed the loo. And she was like, "No, if we're not here, the coach will not stop." This was before the day of mobile phones. So, she couldn't ring and tell them that I needed the loo and the coach needed to stop. No, we were there or we weren't there, and it would go without us. But I'm like, "I need the loo. You can stay here. I will go to that. Look, there's a museum just at the bottom of the road. I'm sure they'll let me use the loo." "No, you must stay here with me in my sight. I promised your mother you cannot go out of my sight." And I was like, "I'm going to pee my pants." And she didn't believe me. People never believe children when they say things like this. They always assume you're putting it on, and then I peed my pants. And I had to go all the way down to Jodrell Bank while they were trying to dry out these pants. I had like a towel wrapped around my waist, and these two charming older girls, and I don't know how old I was, maybe 7 or something. So older girl might have been like 10 for all I know. But were kind of either side of me being super, super nice. And I felt like an absolute prat. And the boys at the back were sniggering and making fun of me. It was awkward as hell. But I'm glad I went. And there was another trip to a chemistry museum in Manchester, and yeah, and we went to various museums quite a lot. But I desperately wanted the world to be fairer and righter, and was frustrated with everything all the time, and felt I knew better than everyone all the time, which in many instances I did, because there were many things that were abjectly unfair about the world. I remember my dad and my mum dragging me along to a neighbour's house, few doors down, for a party, and I didn't feel like I fit in. I felt like I'd be a fish out of water, and yeah, life was just. I felt like they wanted me there to show me off. There was no reason I couldn't have stayed here. I had the phone number for the house. It was 3 doors down. There was no reason for me to physically be there other than from them to show me off. Um, it was a purely symbolic thing. We need you to come and be our token son at this meeting. Could have left me at home quite safely. Um, and I felt totally out of place and suffocating as a fish out of water amongst all of these local kids. And I remember um, kind of inadvertently picking a fight with this braggadocious kid up the road, whom, in fairness, was a lovely lad. But he was going on about how tough and hard he was and how he did martial arts. And I was like, I kind of just reacted badly and started wheedling at him. I'm like, yeah, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're not tough. You're not hard. He was only like 3 or 4 years older than me. You're not tough. You're not hard. Said, oh, but I've got I do karate, and like I desperately wanted to do karate. I desperately wanted to do martial arts, but my mother deeply disapproved because of the Eastern mysticism, and also I think because she felt it encouraged violence, which I don't think it did. I think it actually tends to have the opposite effect on kids. But martial arts training tends to make them a bit more focused and controlled. But she felt it encouraged violence and it would cause me to fight with my brother more. So I was needling and wheedling at this kid who I felt was bragging, and we ended up in a fight. I think it was something on the lines of I said he was a yellow belt, by which I think I meant cowardly rather than necessarily yellow as being a particular important color. Um, and it just ended up in a fight. And me father was outrageously angry with me and banned me from everything forever and sent me home. And the next day, see, he would make pancakes for us every Saturday morning. And it was like, you're banned from pancakes this Saturday morning because you've been bad. And I was there crying. And it was like, oh, he's remorseful. He knows he's been bad. I feel bad for him because he's crying. He clearly is repentant. I will make him pancakes. And so I ate the pancakes. And then there was a question about why I'd been crying. I was like, because it's so unfair. You were so unfair to me. Because from my point of view, it was unfair. The fight only happened because I was put in a situation where I felt out of my depth, a situation I had actively sought to avoid. And I kind of like, in my mind, yeah, this whole fight only came around because I was put in this situation where I didn't want to be interacting with these people I didn't feel comfortable interacting with, and I didn't know how to navigate this social situation. Things would all change very soon. The Toronto blessing was about to happen. My teens were coming, and I was about to get involved in a number of youth organizations that would radically transform my perspective on everything, as would puberty. You suggest